The steam whistle shrieked across the Nevada desert like a wounded animal, its echo bouncing off red canyon walls before dissolving into the merciless heat. But it wasn't the sound of the departing locomotive that made travelers stop and stare. It was what the train had left behind. 5 small figures huddled against the weathered boards of Copper Ridge Station, their clothes little more than rags, their faces hollow with hunger that had carved sharp angles where childhood softness should have been. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest barely walked, and standing 30 feet away, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow half the platform, was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the very mountains themselves. 6 feet 8 inches of weathered leather, and iron will, watching those boys with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. What happened next would change all their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August sun hammered down on Copper Ridge Station with the relentless fury of a blacksmith's forge. Heat waves shimmered off the railroad tracks, making the distant mountains dance like mirages. The wooden platform, bleached gray by years of desert punishment, radiated warmth that could cook an egg. Most passengers who disembarked from the 247 eastbound quickly sought shelter in the station house or hurried to waiting carriages. But these 5 boys had nowhere to go. They sat pressed against the station wall like discarded cargo, their backs to the splintered wood that offered the only shade for miles. The oldest, Thomas Fletcher, kept his arm wrapped protectively around his youngest brother, little William, whose 4-year-old frame trembled despite the scorching heat. Between them sat the others, James, age 10, with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes too old for his face, Henry, 8, clutching a torn cloth bundle that contained everything they owned, and Michael, 6, whose lips were cracked from thirst. Thomas had been trying to make sense of their situation for 3 days now. 3 days since their father had walked them to this very platform, promised he'd be back with work and money, and vanished like smoke on the wind. 3 days of watching trains arrive and depart, each whistle blast a fresh reminder that they'd been forgotten. "He's coming back," Michael whispered for the 100th time, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Papa said he'd come." "Back." Thomas tightened his grip on William, who had stopped crying yesterday when the tears simply ran out. The boy's silence was worse than any sob. Thomas had learned to read hunger in his brothers' faces, the way their cheeks sank inward, how their eyes grew too large, the tremor in their hands when they tried to stand. The station master, a reed-thin man named Cornelius Weeks, had shown them kindness the first day, a cup of water, a biscuit split 5 ways. But his charity had limits, and those limits had been reached. This morning he'd avoided their eyes entirely, sweeping around them as if they were part of the furniture. A merchant's wife had offered them work, cleaning her store in exchange for scraps. But when she'd seen how weak they'd become, how little William could barely stand, she'd changed her mind. "Can't have sickly boys frightening customers," she'd muttered, her skirts rustling as she hurried away. Now the afternoon stretched before them like an endless sentence. The next train wouldn't arrive until evening, and even then, what hope did it carry? Thomas had no money for tickets, no destination in mind. Their father, Marcus Fletcher, had been a dreamer and a drunk, chasing rumors of silver strikes and cattle ranches that needed hands. He dragged them across 3 states in 2 years, each move bringing more promises and deeper poverty. The boys had learned not to trust his words, but they'd had no choice but to follow. And now, somewhere between desperation and delusion, he'd left them to chase another dream that would likely end in another bottle. James shifted uncomfortably, his stomach growling loud enough that a passing businessman glanced their way with distaste. "How long do we wait?" he asked Thomas, though they both knew the answer was burning in the silence between them. "Long as it takes," Thomas replied. though the words felt like ash in his mouth. He was 12 years old, trying to be a father to 4 brothers, and failing at both childhood and manhood. The heat pressed down like a living thing. Henry had stopped sweating hours ago, which Thomas knew was dangerous. Their lips were cracking, their movements growing sluggish. William hadn't spoken since morning, just stared ahead with the blank gaze of a child whose world had collapsed. It was then that the shadow fell across them. At first, Thomas thought it was a cloud passing over the sun, but the shadow didn't move, didn't shift with the wind. It simply stood there, massive and still, blocking out the light like a human eclipse. Thomas looked up slowly, his neck craning back until it ached. The man towering above them seemed to stretch toward the sky itself, broad shoulders that could carry the weight of the world, arms thick as fence posts, hands that looked like they could stop a stampeding bull. His face was weathered brown as saddle leather, carved with lines that spoke of years under the open sky. A black hat sat low over eyes the color of storm clouds, and a mustache drooped over lips that had forgotten how to smile. But it wasn't the man's size that made Thomas's breath catch. It was the way he was looking at them, not with pity, not with disgust, not with the careful indifference most adults had perfected. He was studying them with the intensity of a man taking inventory of something valuable. "How long you boys been sitting here?" The voice rumbled up from somewhere deep in the man's chest, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. Thomas found his voice after a moment. 3 days, sir." The giant cowboy, for that's what he clearly was, from his worn leather chaps, to the Colt .45 that hung easy at his hip, crouched down slowly. Even kneeling, he was nearly as tall as Thomas standing. Up close, his eyes held depths that spoke of loneliness understood, of hard choices made in harder times. Name's Ezekiel. "Crawford," he said, his voice gentler now, but still carrying that rumble of authority. "What's yours?" "Thomas Fletcher, sir. These are my brothers." Thomas gestured weakly to each boy in turn. "James, Henry, Michael, and William." Ezekiel's gaze moved over each face, lingering on little William's glazed stare, on the tremor in Henry's hands, on the way James had unconsciously curled inward, as if trying to disappear. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Where's your folks?" The question hung in the superheated air, like a physical thing. Thomas felt his brothers tense beside him, felt the weight of their collective shame. "Papa went to find work. Said he'd be back." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion toward the boys, but with the calculating gaze of a man who'd heard that particular lie before. He'd seen enough abandoned children on enough platforms to recognize the hollow ring of false hope. "When was that? 3 days ago." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his massive frame blocking the sun so completely that the boys sat in blessed coolness for the first time all day. Thomas could hear the man's breathing, steady and deep, like a mountain drawing air. "You boys, eaten today?" The question was simple, but it cut through Thomas like a blade. He shook his head, not trusting his voice. Ezekiel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a handful of jerky and hardtack, more food than the boys had seen in days. He broke each piece carefully, distributing it with the methodical precision of a man who understood hunger. The boys ate with desperate gratitude, trying not to appear too eager, too needy. But Ezekiel saw through their politeness to the gnawing emptiness beneath. He watched William struggle to chew the tough jerky with baby teeth, saw how Thomas made sure everyone else ate before taking his own portion. "Station master know you're he here?" Ezekiel asked. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied between careful bites. "But he can't. We don't have money for rooms or tickets or—" "I understand." Ezekiel's voice carried no judgment, only the flat acknowledgement of hard facts. He stood slowly, his shadow shifting, and Thomas felt the brutal heat slam back down on them like a physical blow. For a moment, Thomas thought the giant was leaving, that this brief kindness was all they could expect from the world. His heart sank, even as gratitude for the food warmed his belly. But Ezekiel didn't walk away. Instead, he turned toward the station house, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Through the window, Thomas could see him speaking with Cornelius Weeks, their voices too low to carry, but their gestures clear enough. Money changed hands. The station master nodded repeatedly, his manner shifting from indifference to something approaching respect. When Ezekiel returned, he carried a bucket of water and a dipper. The boys drank greedily, water spilling down their chins, their bodies, finally remembering what it felt like to be human instead of slowly dying animals. "Mr. Crawford," Thomas began, but Ezekiel held up one massive hand. "You boys got any other family? Aunts, uncles, grandparents?" Thomas shook his head. "Just Papa. Mama died when William was born." The words seemed to strike something deep in Ezekiel's chest. His eyes grew distant for a moment, as if looking at ghosts only he could see. When his focus returned, there was something different in his expression. Something resolved. "Your Papa," Ezekiel said carefully, "he give you any idea where he was? Headed? Said something about silver mines up north, or maybe cattle work in Colorado?" Thomas's voice grew smaller with each word, the uncertainty in them betraying the truth they all knew but couldn't speak. Ezekiel nodded slowly. He'd worked enough ranches, visited enough mining towns to know the type of man who chased rumors and left responsibilities behind. The desert was full of such men, and full of the wreckage they left in their wake. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Soon it would be night, and the desert cold would replace the desert heat. The boys had no blankets, no shelter, no protection against the temperature drop that could kill as surely as the sun. Ezekiel looked at each face again, seeing not the dirt and desperation, but something else. In Thomas, he saw a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of his own father. In James, a quiet intelligence that just needed nurturing. In Henry, an artist's soul trapped in circumstances that offered no beauty. In Michael, the playful spirit that hunger had temporarily crushed but not destroyed. And in little William, the pure trust that only the very young possessed. He thought of his own ranch, 30 miles south, where the land rolled green and endless, where cattle grazed and horses ran free. He thought of the silence that filled his days, the emptiness that echoed in every room of his too large house. He thought of the promises he'd made to a woman who died before he could keep them, and the children they'd never had. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Ezekiel straightened to his full, imposing height and looked down at the 5 brothers with eyes that had made their choice. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're coming with me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hung in the desert air like a promise carved from stone. Thomas Fletcher stared up at the towering figure of Ezekiel Crawford, his young mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Around him, his brothers had gone completely still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible moment. "Sir?" Thomas's voice cracked on the single word. Ezekiel's storm-grey eyes never wavered. "Pack whatever you've got. We leave in 10 minutes. James found his voice first among the younger boys. Where are we going?" "Home," Ezekiel replied, the word carrying a weight that seemed to settle something deep in his chest. "My ranch. 30 miles south of here." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 days of abandonment had taught him to be suspicious of kindness, to look for the trap hidden beneath generous words. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." For the first time, something that might have been a smile ghosted across Ezekiel's weathered features. Sometimes knowing isn't what matters, son. Sometimes what matters is seeing. He turned toward the station house again, his boots thundering on the wooden planks. Through the dusty window, the boys watched him approach, a telegraph operator who'd been dozing in the afternoon heat. More money changed hands, and the operator suddenly became very interested in his equipment. "He's sending a wire," Henry whispered, his 8-year-old voice filled with wonder. "About us?" Thomas's stomach clenched. "Maybe he's checking if we're wanted for something. Maybe he thinks we're criminals." But Michael, despite his 6 years and the hunger that had clouded his thoughts for days, shook his head with surprising certainty. "No, he's got kind eyes, like Mama used to have." The mention of their mother sent a familiar ache through all 5 boys. Elizabeth Fletcher had been dead 4 years, but her memory remained the one constant in their chaotic lives. She'd been the steady hand that had held their family together, the voice that had sung them to sleep, the arms that had made even their poorest shacks feel like sanctuaries. Ezekiel returned carrying a telegram form in his massive hand. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket without explanation. Then he looked down at the huddled group, his expression businesslike but not unkind. "Any of you boys afraid of horses?" 4 heads shook in unison. Only William, still cradled in Thomas's arms, remained motionless, his glazed eyes staring at. "Nothing? Good, we've got a ride ahead of us." Ezekiel led them around the station to where a massive black stallion stood tethered in whatever shade the building provided. The horse was as imposing as its owner, easily 17 hands high, with intelligent eyes and a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian. A pack mule waited nearby, loaded with supplies that suggested Ezekiel had been planning for more than just a day trip to town. "This is Goliath," Ezekiel said, running one hand along the stallion's neck. "He's carried me through blizzards, sandstorms, and Indian raids. He won't let us down." Thomas stared at the horse with a mixture of awe and terror. "We can't all fit on one horse." "No," Ezekiel agreed, "but we can all fit on 2. He moved to the mule with practiced efficiency, redistributing the supplies to make room. Then, with the kind of strength that made impossible things look effortless, he lifted William from Thomas's arms. The little boy didn't resist, didn't even seem fully aware of what was happening. "He's sick," Thomas said quickly, fear sharpening his voice. "The heat, and we haven't eaten much, and I know." Ezekiel's voice was gentle as he examined William with experienced eyes. "Desert fever, seen it before. He needs water, food, and rest in that order." He looked at Thomas with something approaching respect. "You've done good, keeping him alive this long." The praise hit Thomas like a physical blow. For 3 days, he'd felt like he was failing his brothers, watching them grow weaker while he stood helpless. To hear this giant of a man say he'd done good, it was almost too much to bear. Ezekiel settled William carefully on the mule, then helped Henry and Michael climb up behind him. The pack mule was gentle and patient, seeming to understand the precious nature of his cargo. James climbed onto Goliath with the fearless determination of a 10-year-old who'd never met a challenge he wouldn't face, and Ezekiel lifted Thomas up behind him. "Hold tight," Ezekiel instructed as he swung himself into the saddle with fluid grace. Despite his size, he moved like a man born to horseback. "It's going to be a long ride." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they left Copper Ridge Station behind. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of sagebrush and red stone that could swallow a man whole. But Ezekiel navigated it like he was reading a familiar book, following trails that were invisible to anyone else. As they rode, the heat began to lose its savage edge. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of distant water and growing things. Thomas, pressed against Ezekiel's broad back, felt the steady rhythm of the man's breathing, heard the low rumble of his voice as he spoke quietly to Goliath. "Mr. Crawford," Thomas ventured after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. "Ezekiel's." "Fine, son. Ezekiel, why are you helping us?" "Really?" The big man was quiet for so long that Thomas wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully contained. "Had a wife once, Catherine. We planned to fill our ranch with children, planned to have so many that the house would never be quiet, never be empty." He paused, his hand tightening slightly on the reins. "She died before we could make those. Plans real. Fever took her one winter and took our first child with her." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry. That was 7 years ago. Been living alone ever since, telling myself I preferred the quiet. Then I saw you boys today, and I realized I'd been lying to myself for a long time." The honesty in those words struck something deep in Thomas's chest. He'd spent so much of his young life trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else carry the weight. Behind them on the mule, Henry was asking James about the landscape they were passing through, his artist's eye cataloguing the way the light painted the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Michael had fallen asleep against Henry's back, his small body finally relaxing for the first time in days. William remained silent, but his breathing was steadier, and some color had returned to his pale cheeks. As the miles rolled beneath them, Ezekiel began to talk about his ranch. The Crawford spread covered nearly 10,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Nevada. There were cattle, yes, but also horses that he bred and trained for the cavalry. There was a house built from timber he'd hauled down from the mountains himself, with enough rooms for a dozen children and a kitchen that Catherine had designed but never lived to use. "Got a foreman named Santiago Martinez," Ezekiel said as they crested a ridge and the land opened up before them like a green promise. "He's been after me for years to hire more hands, but I've been too stubborn to admit I needed help. His wife, Elena, she's been running the domestic side of things since Catherine passed. Good people. They'll welcome you boys like their own." Thomas stared out over the valley that spread below them. Grass rolled in waves toward distant mountains, and he could see cattle scattered like brown dots across the landscape. A river wound through it all, silver in the fading light, and there in the middle of it all stood a house that looked like something from a dream. It was larger than any house Thomas had ever seen, built of honey-colored logs with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and warm light glowed in windows that promised safety and belonging. Outbuildings dotted the landscape around it. Barns, corrals, bunkhouses, all speaking of prosperity earned through honest work. "That's home," Ezekiel said simply, but Thomas heard the pride and love in his voice. James leaned forward in the saddle. "All of this is yours." "All of this is ours," Ezekiel corrected gently, "if you boys want it to be." As they descended into the valley, figures emerged from the buildings. A Mexican man, with silver threading his black hair, approached leading a fresh horse. A woman in a blue dress stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she watched their approach. Children appeared from various corners of the ranch, drawn by curiosity and the promise of something interesting happening. Santiago Martinez reached them first, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he took in the sight of 5 boys clinging to Ezekiel's horses. He spoke in rapid Spanish, too fast for any of the brothers to follow, but his tone was warm and welcoming. "English, Santiago," Ezekiel said with gentle humor. "These boys need to understand what's being said." Santiago's smile widened. "I was saying that it's about time this ranch had some young voices in it. Elena has been praying for this day for years." Elena Martinez hurried down from the porch, her round face beaming with maternal warmth. She was a small woman, barely reaching, Ezekiel's chest, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who ruled her domain absolutely. Her dark eyes took in the boy's condition with a single glance, and Thomas saw her expression shift into the focused determination of a woman with work to do. "Pobrecitos," she murmured, reaching up to help William down from the mule. "So thin, so pale. But we fix this, yes? We fix everything." Ezekiel dismounted and began helping the other boys down, his movements gentle despite his size. As Thomas's feet touched solid ground, he felt his legs wobble slightly. 3 days of sitting on hard boards had left him weak, but more than that, he felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in their circumstances. "This is real?" he asked Ezekiel quietly, as Elena bustled around them, issuing rapid instructions in Spanish to the various ranch hands who'd gathered to help. Ezekiel knelt down so he was eye-level with Thomas, his massive hands resting lightly on the boy's thin shoulders. "Son, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You boys belong here, all 5 of you." As if to prove his point, William chose that moment to speak his first words since leaving the station. Looking up at Elena with his 4-year-old eyes, he whispered, "Are you going to take care of us?" Elena's face crumpled with emotion. She gathered the little boy into her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held him close. "Sí, mijo, we take care of you forever and always." The sun disappeared behind the mountains as the unlikely family made their way toward the house, toward warmth and food and the promise of belonging. For the first time in 3 days, Thomas Fletcher allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were finally safe. The Crawford ranch house was even more magnificent up close than it had appeared from the ridge. As Elena Martinez ushered the 5 Fletcher brothers through the front door, their bare feet silent on polished hardwood floors, Thomas felt like he was stepping into a different world entirely. The main room stretched wide and welcoming, dominated by a stone fireplace large enough for a man to stand upright inside. Thick rugs covered the floors, their patterns speaking of distant places and careful craftsmanship. Furniture built for comfort rather than show filled the space. Deep leather chairs that could swallow a grown man, a dining table carved from a single massive oak, shelves lined with books that promised winter evenings of stories yet untold. But it was the details that made Thomas's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. A woman's touch lingered everywhere, despite Ezekiel's claim that he'd lived alone for 7 years. Embroidered pillows on the sofa, delicate china displayed behind glass doors, a piano in the corner with sheet music still open on the stand, as if Catherine Crawford might walk in at any moment to continue her interrupted song. "Elena keeps it just as Catherine left it," Ezekiel said quietly, noticing Thomas's gaze. "Says a house should remember the love that built it." Elena herself was already in motion, her small hands gentle but efficient as she examined each boy in turn. She clicked her tongue softly at their condition, the hollow cheeks, the way their clothes hung loose on frames that should have been filling out with growing muscle and healthy fat. Her dark eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, though Thomas sensed it wasn't directed at them. "Santiago," she called toward the door, "bring the copper tub from the pantry, and heat water, lots of water. These boys need proper baths before anything else." "Yes, querida," came Santiago's voice from outside, followed by the sound of boots on wood and rapid Spanish instructions to unseen ranch hands. James, who had been silent during the ride, but whose eyes had catalogued every detail of their new surroundings, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, we don't want to be any trouble." Elena's face softened as she looked down at the 10-year-old boy. "Trouble? Mijo, you are not trouble. You are blessings." She gestured around the large, empty house. "For too long, this place has been too quiet. A house this size, it needs children. It needs laughter and noise and—" She paused, her eyes growing distant and little feet running on the stairs. Ezekiel moved to the fireplace and began building up the flames, his movements economical and practiced. The growing light flickered across his weathered features, and Thomas noticed something he hadn't seen before. Photographs on the mantelpiece. A woman with gentle eyes and dark hair arranged in the fashion of a decade past. The same woman, standing beside a younger Ezekiel, both of them beaming at the camera with the joy of people who believed their future was guaranteed. "That's Catherine," Ezekiel said without looking up from the fire. "She would have loved you boys, especially you, William." Little William, still cradled in Elena's arms, turned his head at the sound of his name. For the first time since they'd left the station, his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond his own private world of exhaustion and fear. "Why especially me?" he whispered, his 4-year-old voice barely audible. Ezekiel straightened slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming alive. He approached them with careful steps, as if afraid sudden movements might spook the child. "Because," he said, kneeling down so he was at William's eye level, "she always said the littlest ones needed the most protecting. And you, son, are about the littlest thing I've ever seen." A ghost of a smile flickered across William's pale face, gone so quickly Thomas almost missed it. But Elena saw it too, and her own smile bloomed like sunrise. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that felt almost dreamlike after the static despair of their 3 days at the station. Santiago and 2 ranch hands hauled in the copper bathtub and filled it with steaming water heated over the kitchen. A fire. Elena produced soap that smelled of lavender and towels soft as cloud. She'd also somehow conjured clean clothes, shirts and pants that were too big but could be rolled up and cinched with rope belts. "From the mission in town," she explained. When Thomas asked where the clothes had come from, "Father Miguel keeps donations for families in need. I sent word ahead with young Pablo here." She nodded toward a Mexican boy of perhaps 16 who stood respectfully by the door. He rode fast to bring them back. The baths were a revelation. Thomas had forgotten what it felt like to be truly clean, to have hot water washing away not just dirt, but the accumulated weight of worry and fear. Elena had tactfully withdrawn to give them privacy, but her voice carried from the kitchen where she was preparing what she promised would be a feast. Henry emerged from his turn in the tub, looking more like a child and less like a refugee. His sandy hair, freed from weeks of grime, caught the firelight and made him seem younger somehow. Michael's natural exuberance began to return as warm water worked its magic on his small frame. Even James, always the most serious of the brothers, allowed himself a moment of pure pleasure as he sank into the blessed heat. William required the most careful attention. His skin was almost translucent from malnutrition, and Thomas could count his ribs through the pale flesh. But Ezekiel helped with the bathing, his enormous hands surprisingly gentle as he washed the little boy's hair and wrapped him in warm towels. "He's going to be fine," Ezekiel said quietly to Thomas as they worked together. "I've seen cowboys come back from winter range looking worse than this. Good food, rest, and caring. That's all any of us really need." By the time all 5 boys were clean and dressed, Elena had transformed the dining room into something out of a fairy tale. The long oak table groaned under the weight of food. Roasted chicken that fell off the bone, mashed potatoes rich with butter, green beans from the ranch garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a chocolate cake that made Michael's eyes grow as wide as saucers. "Sit, sit," Elena commanded, bustling around them with serving spoons and maternal authority. "Eat as much as you want. There is always more." The boys approached the table with the reverence of people who had learned not to trust abundance. They sat carefully on chairs that seemed too fine for their rough clothing, their hands folded in their laps, as if afraid to reach for the bounty spread before them. "Go ahead," Ezekiel encouraged, taking his own place at the head of the table. "Elena doesn't cook for show. She cooks to fill bellies." Thomas took the first tentative bite, and the flavor exploded across his tongue like a symphony. He'd forgotten food could taste like this, could be more than just fuel for survival. Around him, his brothers began to eat with increasing enthusiasm, though they still moved carefully, as if afraid this might all be an elaborate dream. As they ate, Elena kept up a gentle stream of chatter, telling them about the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about the school in town that would welcome them come September. Santiago added his own observations, describing the swimming hole down by the river and the wild horses that sometimes came down from the mountains. "There's a mare," Santiago said, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke, black as midnight with a white star on her forehead. "She's been running free for 3 years now, too smart and too proud to be caught. But she comes close sometimes, curious about what we're doing. Maybe with young hands and patient hearts, she might be convinced to join our family." Henry looked up from his plate, eyes bright with interest. Could we try to catch her?" "If Ezekiel says yes, then we try," Santiago replied with a grin. "But first, you must learn to ride the horses that want to be ridden." The conversation continued as the meal progressed, each brother gradually relaxing into the warmth and acceptance that surrounded them. Thomas watched his siblings come alive again, saw Michael's mischievous smile return, heard James ask thoughtful questions about ranch life, noticed Henry's artistic eye cataloguing the beautiful objects that filled the house. But it was William's transformation that struck him most deeply. The little boy had climbed into Ezekiel's lap without invitation, his small head resting against the big man's chest as he nibbled on a piece of cake. For the first time in days, William looked peaceful, protected, safe. "Tell me about your papa," Elena said gently as they finished eating. The question hung in the air without judgment, but Thomas felt his shoulders tense anyway. "He's not a bad man," Thomas said quickly, feeling the need to defend the father who had abandoned them. He gets ideas about places we should go, things we should do. He means well." Elena nodded with the wisdom of someone who had seen many kinds of men pass through her life. "Sometimes meaning well is not the same as doing well. See, he said he'd come back," Michael added, though his voice held less conviction than it had 3 days ago. Ezekiel's hand tightened slightly around William, but his voice remained gentle. "Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but either way, you boys have a place here for as long as you want it." "What if he comes looking for us?" James asked, the practical question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Ezekiel replied. "But for now, tonight, you're safe, you're fed, you're clean, and you're wanted. That's enough for today." As if summoned by his words, exhaustion began to overtake them all. William was already asleep in Ezekiel's arms, his small body finally surrendering to the safety he'd found. The other boys swayed in their chairs, their eyelids heavy with the first real peace they'd known in months. Elena began clearing the table with quiet efficiency, while Santiago banked the fire for the night. Ezekiel stood carefully, cradling William against his shoulder, and gestured for the other boys to follow. "Come on, sons. Let me show you to your rooms." He led them up a wide staircase to the second floor, where a long hallway stretched in both directions. Doors opened onto bedrooms that seemed impossibly grand to boys who had been sleeping on train station floors. Each room had a real bed with clean sheets and warm blankets, a window that looked out over the moonlit ranch, and space, enough for dreams to grow. "Thomas, you're here," Ezekiel said, opening the first door to reveal a room with furniture built for a growing boy. "James and Henry, you share this one." He indicated the next door. "Michael, this one's yours. And William," he paused at the largest bedroom, the one that clearly served as the master suite. "William stays with me tonight. Until he's feeling stronger." Thomas felt a pang at the separation from his youngest brother, but he saw the wisdom in it. William needed watching, needed the kind of care that only someone with experience could provide. "Thank you," Thomas said, the words inadequate for the overwhelming gratitude he felt. Ezekiel looked down at him with eyes that held understanding beyond words. "Son, you don't need to thank me for giving you what every child deserves. You thank people for favors, not for love." As Thomas settled into the first real bed he'd slept in for months, his body sinking into soft mattresses and clean sheets, he listened to the sounds of the house around him. Elena's voice murmuring prayers in Spanish, Santiago checking the doors and windows with the careful attention of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. The gentle creak of floorboards as Ezekiel moved around his room, settling William into what was probably the safest place the little boy had ever known. For the first time since their father had walked away from that station platform, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be all right. The weight of being the man of the family, the protector and provider for 4 younger brothers, began to ease from his shoulders. Outside his window, the Nevada night stretched vast and star-filled, no longer empty and threatening, but full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new adaptations to this life they'd never dared to dream of. But tonight, wrapped in warmth and safety, Thomas Fletcher closed his eyes and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a child who no longer had to carry the world on his shoulders. Dawn crept across the Crawford ranch like a painter working with liquid gold, transforming the landscape from shadow and mystery into something Thomas Fletcher had never imagined could exist. He woke not to the harsh whistle of a departing train or the ache of sleeping on wooden boards, but to the gentle symphony of a working ranch coming alive. Roosters called from the chicken coop, horses nickered softly in the corrals, cattle lowed in distant pastures, and beneath it all, the comforting sound of human voices beginning their day's work. Santiago's rich baritone giving instructions in rapid Spanish, Elena's melodic replies from the kitchen, the laughter of ranch hands preparing for another day under the Nevada sun. Thomas lay still for a long moment, afraid to move, afraid that motion might shatter this impossible dream. The bed beneath him was real, soft mattress, clean sheets that smelled of sunshine and lavender. The room around him was real too, with its sturdy furniture and windows that framed a view so beautiful it made his chest ache. A soft knock at his door broke his reverie. "Thomas, you awake, mijo?" Elena's voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. Thomas sat up quickly, suddenly conscious that he was wearing borrowed clothes in a borrowed room, that he didn't belong in this place of beauty and abundance. "Yes, ma'am," he called back. "Good. Come downstairs when you're ready. There's much to see, and the day won't wait for sleepyheads." Thomas dressed quickly in the clothes that were still too large for his thin frame, rolling up sleeves and cuffs, until they approximated a fit. When he made his way downstairs, he found the kitchen alive with activity that put their feast of the night before to shame. Elena stood at a massive cast-iron stove, tending to what seemed like a dozen different pans at once. The air was rich with the scents of bacon, eggs, fresh biscuits and coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. James sat at a smaller table in the corner, already dressed and clean, watching Elena's movements with the fascination of someone who had never seen such abundance prepared with such casual expertise. "Where are the others?" Thomas asked. "Henry is in the barn with Santiago, learning about the horses," Elena replied without turning from her cooking. "That boy has an eye for beauty. He sees things others miss. Michael is feeding the chickens with Pablo, though I think more corn is going in his mouth than in the feed bucket. And William is right here," came Ezekiel's deep voice from the doorway. The big man entered carrying the 4-year-old, who looked better than he had since before their father's disappearance. Color had returned to William's cheeks. His eyes were clear and focused, and he was actually smiling, a sight that made Thomas's heart leap with relief. He woke up asking for his brothers. Ezekiel continued, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. Seemed like he'd slept enough for 3 nights running. William looked around the kitchen with the wide-eyed wonder of a child seeing magic. "Thomas, look how big everything is!" And Elena made pancakes shaped like horses. Sure enough, the griddle held pancakes molded into recognizable equine shapes, complete with manes and tails created from carefully poured batter. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about the kind of care Elena brought to even the simplest tasks. "You like horses, little one?" Elena asked William, her smile warm as summer sunshine. William nodded enthusiastically. "Papa used to tell stories about wild mustangs that could run faster than the wind. He said someday we'd have our own horses and ride across the whole world." Thomas felt his stomach clench at the mention of their father. Even now, even safe and fed and warm, the boys still spoke of Marcus Fletcher with hope and longing. It was a complication Ezekiel would have to navigate carefully. "Maybe not the whole world," Ezekiel said gently, "but this ranch has plenty of room for riding. Once you boys are settled in, we'll start teaching you proper horsemanship." "Really?" James looked up from his plate, eyes bright with interest. "Really? Can't live on a ranch and not know horses. It'd be like trying to swim without knowing water." Elena began loading plates with food, her movements efficient but never hurried. As she set breakfast before them, Thomas marveled again at the casual abundance. More food than the 5 brothers could eat in a day, prepared without fanfare, offered without conditions. "Elena," Thomas said hesitantly, "this must cost a lot. The food, the clothes, the rooms. We don't have any way to pay you back." Elena's hands stilled for a moment. Then she turned to face him, with eyes that held depths of understanding. "Mijo, you think taking care of children is about money?" "I don't know what it's about," Thomas admitted. "I've been trying to take care of my brothers for months, and I kept failing. I couldn't keep us fed, couldn't keep us safe, couldn't even keep us together when Papa left." Ezekiel leaned forward in his chair, his grey eyes serious. "Son, you kept 5 boys alive on a train station platform for 3 days in desert heat. With no food and no help. That's not failing, that's a miracle. But nothing." Elena's voice carried the finality of a mother settling an argument. "You did what you had to do with what you had. Now you have more. We all have more." The kitchen door swung open and Henry burst in, his face flushed with excitement and his clothes already dusty from the barn. "Thomas, you have to see the horses. Santiago says there's one that's almost pure white, and another one that's so black it's like looking at midnight, and there's babies, foals he called them, and they're so small and perfect, and one of them tried to eat my hair." His enthusiasm was infectious. Even James smiled at his younger brother's excitement, and William clapped his hands in delight at the animated description. "And there's cats in the barn," Henry continued breathlessly. "Not just 1 or 2, but a whole family. Santiago says they keep the mice away, but I think they're just there because barns are good places for cats to live. And he showed me how to milk a cow, but I'm not very good at it yet, and—" "Slow down, mijo," Elena laughed. "Breathe before you faint." Michael chose that moment to arrive, Pablo close behind him. The 6-year-old was covered in corn dust and feathers, with a streak of something that might have been egg yolk on his cheek. His grin was wide enough to split his face. "I fed all the chickens," he announced proudly, "and Pablo showed me where they lay their eggs. And there were so many eggs, and one of the hens tried to peck me, but Pablo said she was just being protective of her babies. And you look like you've been wrestling with the entire chicken." "Coop," Elena observed, but her tone was fond rather than critical. "Wash your hands and face, then eat. Growing boys need food more than chickens need corn scattered everywhere." As the boys settled around the table, the kitchen filled with the kind of warm chaos that families create without trying, William insisted on sitting next to Ezekiel. perched on a cushion that brought him to table height. Henry chattered about everything he'd seen in the barn. Michael described each chicken individually, complete with names he'd assigned to his favorites. James asked careful questions about ranch operations, his practical mind already working to understand their new world. And Thomas, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply listened. He didn't have to make decisions, didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, didn't have to scan the horizon for threats. He could just be 12 years old, eating breakfast with his brothers in a warm kitchen, while adults took care of the details. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. After breakfast, Ezekiel announced, I thought we'd take a tour of the ranch, all of it. The barns, the corrals, the bunkhouse, the fields. You boys need to understand what this place is, how it works, where you fit into it. Where we fit. Thomas asked, Son, this isn't charity. This ranch runs on work, and everyone who lives here contributes according to their ability. You boys will have chores, responsibilities, things that are yours to handle. Not punishment, but purpose. There's a difference. Santiago appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his weathered face serious. Ezekiel, we need to talk. Private-like. The two men stepped outside, their voices too low to carry through the kitchen windows. But Thomas saw the tension in Santiago's posture, the way Ezekiel's hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip. Something was wrong. What do you think they're talking about? James asked quietly. Nothing good, Thomas replied, his old instincts for danger reasserting themselves. Men don't look like that when they're discussing cattle. Elena seemed to sense the shift in mood. She moved closer to the table, her presence protective and calming. Finish your breakfast, she said gently. Whatever it is, it can wait until you've eaten properly. But Thomas had lost his appetite. The brief interlude of safety and normalcy suddenly felt fragile, as if it might shatter at the first sign of real trouble. He'd been foolish to think that 3 days on a train platform was the worst thing that could happen to them. Life had taught him that there was always something worse waiting just around the corner. When Ezekiel and Santiago returned, their faces were carefully neutral. But Thomas saw the way the big man's eyes moved over the boys, as if cataloguing them, protecting them with his gaze. Everything all right? Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Wire came in from Copper Ridge, Santiago said carefully. Seems someone's been asking questions about 5 boys who disappeared from the station. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle bubbling of coffee on the stove. Thomas felt his world tilt sideways, the brief security he'd found suddenly as fragile as morning frost. Papa, William whispered, his small voice hopeful. Ezekiel knelt beside the little boy's chair, his massive frame folding down so they were eye to eye. Maybe, son, maybe not. The wire didn't say who was asking, just that someone was. What does that mean for us? Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the fear racing through his veins. It means we need to be prepared, Ezekiel replied, for anything. But it also means you boys are under my protection now, legal and proper. I sent some wires of my own last night, to the territorial judge, to the sheriff in Carson City, to people who can make sure that whatever happens, you boys stay safe. Thomas stared at this man who had taken them in without question, who had fed and clothed and sheltered them, and who was now apparently prepared to fight legal battles to keep them. Why? He asked. Why would you do all this for strangers? Ezekiel's weathered face softened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Because sometimes, son, strangers are just family you haven't met yet, and family protects family, no matter what. Outside, the Nevada sun continued its climb toward midday, promising heat and hard work and all the challenges that came with ranch life. But inside the kitchen of the Crawford ranch, 5 boys who had been abandoned and forgotten found themselves surrounded by people who were prepared to fight for them, to claim them, to make them part of something larger than themselves. The questions would come. The complications would arise. The past would have to be faced and the future planned. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. They were wanted. They were home. The morning sun had climbed to its merciless peak when the rider appeared on the eastern ridge, a lone figure silhouetted against the blazing Nevada sky. From the ranch house porch, where he stood with a cup of coffee growing cold in his massive hands, Ezekiel Crawford watched the approaching horseman with the stillness of a predator assessing potential threat. Santiago materialized beside him with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd spent decades reading danger in the landscape. "Single rider," he murmured in his accented English. "Coming hard, but not running. Purposeful." Through the kitchen window, the sounds of the Fletcher brothers continued their morning routine. Henry's excited chatter about the barn cats, Michael's detailed report on chicken behavior, William's soft laughter as Elena taught him to crack. Eggs without getting shell in the bowl, normal sounds, family sounds, sounds that Ezekiel had never expected to hear in his house again. "Could be anyone," Santiago continued, but his hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered Colt. "Supply merchant, neighbor with news, drifter looking for work." Ezekiel's grey eyes never left the approaching figure. "Could be. But men with innocent business don't ride that hard in this heat unless they're carrying urgent news or bad intentions." The rider drew closer, and details began to emerge from the heat shimmer. A man of medium build on a bay gelding, wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as neither wealthy nor destitute. Working man's attire kept clean but showing wear. His hat was pulled low, but something about the way he sat his horse spoke. Of long miles recently traveled and longer miles yet to come. "Should I get the boys inside?" Santiago asked. Ezekiel considered this, weighing caution against the need to avoid alarming the children unnecessarily. "Not yet, but keep Elena aware. If this goes bad, I want them in the root cellar until it's over." Thomas Fletcher chose that moment to step onto the porch, having noticed the sudden tension in the adults' voices. At 12, he'd developed an instinct for trouble that served him well, but robbed him of the carefree ignorance that childhood should provide. "What is it?" he asked, his eyes following Ezekiel's gaze to the approaching rider. "Maybe nothing," Ezekiel replied honestly. "Maybe something. Part of learning to live on a ranch is understanding that visitors can bring news, good or bad." The rider reached the yard fence and dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd been in the saddle for hours. Up close, he appeared to be in his 30s, with the lean build and weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. His clothes were dusty but decent, his horse well cared for but showing signs of hard travel. "Morning," the stranger called, his voice carrying the neutral politeness of someone unsure of his welcome. "I'm looking for Ezekiel Crawford." "You found him." Ezekiel stepped down from the porch, his impressive height and breadth immediately apparent. Santiago flanked him to the left, while Thomas remained on the porch, but within earshot. "What's your business?" The stranger's eyes flickered over the group, lingering momentarily on Thomas before returning to Ezekiel. "Name's Daniel Morrison. I'm a detective from San Francisco, working a case involving some missing children. Got word you might have information about 5 boys who disappeared from Copper Ridge Station a few days back." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. The carefully constructed security of the past day and night suddenly felt as substantial as morning mist. Beside him, he heard Elena's sharp intake of breath from inside the kitchen, and the cheerful chatter of his brothers died away into nervous silence. "Detective, you say?" Ezekiel's voice remained steady, but Thomas caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his right hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "That's interesting. What makes 5 abandoned children a matter for San Francisco law?" Morrison reached slowly into his vest pocket and produced a leather wallet containing official papers and a badge that gleamed silver in the harsh sunlight. "Because these aren't just any children, Mr. Crawford. They're wanted in connection with a theft in Sacramento, substantial theft. Their father hired me to track them down before the law gets involved officially." The lie hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd lived with his father's weaknesses, his drinking and dreaming and endless schemes, but Marcus Fletcher had never been a thief. And the idea that he would hire anyone to find his sons only to accuse them of crimes they hadn't committed was so preposterous it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. "That's not true," Thomas said, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "We never stole anything. We've never even been to Sacramento." Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "Well, now, that's curious. How would you know what I'm talking about unless you're one of the boys I'm looking for?" Ezekiel moved smoothly between Thomas and the detective, his massive frame creating a wall of protection. "Easy there, Morrison. The boy's just defending his family's honor. Nothing wrong with that." "His family?" Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "Funny thing about that. See, I've got paperwork here that says these boys are wards of the state of California, turned over to authorities when their father couldn't provide for them. Says they ran away from a Christian children's home in Sacramento, taking with them a considerable sum of money meant for the orphanage's operations." Santiago spat into the dust at his feet. "Papers can say anything if you pay the right man to. Write them." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, a subtle shift that Ezekiel caught immediately. The big rancher's own weapon cleared leather with surprising speed for such a large man, the metallic click of the hammer being pulled back loud. In the sudden silence, "I wouldn't," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man prepared to kill. "My ranch, my rules, and rule number 1 is that nobody threatens children under my protection." "Your protection," Morrison laughed, but there was nervousness in it now. "You've got no legal claim to these boys. They're coming with me back to California to face justice." "Justice." Eleanor's voice rang out from the porch where she'd appeared with a rolling pin in her hands and fire in her dark eyes. "You want to talk about justice? Justice is 5 starving children finding safety and love. Justice is not letting corrupt men steal babies from their beds with false papers and lies." Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see his younger brothers, pressed against the glass, Henry's face pale with confusion, Michael's eyes wide with fear, James standing protectively in front of little William. The sight of their terror cut through Thomas like a knife. "Ezekiel," Thomas said quietly, "maybe I should just go with him, if it keeps my brothers safe." "Absolutely not." Ezekiel's voice brooked no argument. "You're not going anywhere with this man, and neither are your brothers." Morrison's facade of official authority was beginning to crack. "You're interfering with a legal investigation, Crawford. That's a federal crime." "Then I guess you better ride to Carson City and fetch the federal marshal," Ezekiel replied calmly. "Until then, these boys stay right where they are. You can't fight the law forever. Maybe not, but I can fight you right now, and that seems like a good place to start." Santiago had moved during the conversation, positioning himself where he could cover Morrison from a different angle. His weathered hands were steady on his rifle, and his expression held the grim determination of a man who'd fought in the Mexican War and lived to tell about it. Morrison looked between the 2 armed men and seemed to recognize that his odds of leaving with the children had dropped considerably. But instead of backing down, his expression shifted to something uglier, more desperate. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "These boys' father owes money to some very dangerous people. If I don't bring them back, others will come, others who won't be as reasonable as I am." Thomas felt his world tilt sideways. His father had always been a dreamer and a drunk, but the idea that Marcus Fletcher might have involved his children in something truly dangerous had never occurred to him. The guilt and fear he'd been carrying since their abandonment suddenly deepened into something darker. "What kind of money?" Ezekiel asked, his gun never wavering. "Gambling debts, to men who don't accept excuses or delays. Men who collect on debts, using whatever leverage they can find." Morrison's eyes moved to Thomas with something that might have been genuine sympathy. "Your father bet everything he had and everything he could borrow on a poker game in San Francisco. When he lost, he promised to pay with interest within 30 days. When he couldn't, he offered his sons as collateral for more time." The words hit Thomas like bullets. His father hadn't just abandoned them, he'd sold them, put them up as stakes, in a game he couldn't win, against men who would use children as pawns in their cruel business. "You're lying," Thomas whispered, but even as he said it, he felt the terrible ring of truth in Morrison's words. "I wish I were, boy. But your father signed papers, legal documents that give his creditors certain rights regarding his property, including his children." Elena's rolling pin cracked against the porch railing with the force of her anger. "Children are not property. Children are not collateral for a coward's debts." Morrison shrugged with apparent indifference. "Law's the law, ma'am, and the law says these boys belong to the men who hold their father's markers." Ezekiel's face had gone stone cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence. "Then the law's going to have to come through me to collect. One man against the organization I represent? You're brave, I'll give you that. But brave don't stop bullets, and it sure don't stop the kind of men who'll come next. Maybe not, but it stops you. Right here, right now." Morrison seemed to realize that his mission was not going to succeed today. His hand moved away from his gun, and he began backing toward his horse with the careful movements of a man who didn't want to trigger a shooting war. "This isn't over, Crawford. These boys are marked now, and marked property has a way of finding its way back to its rightful owners. You might delay the inevitable, but you can't stop it." He swung into his saddle with practiced ease, his horse dancing impatiently under the tension that filled the yard. "I'll be back, and next time I won't come alone." "Next time," Ezekiel replied quietly, "I'll be ready." Morrison spurred his horse toward the ridge, dust rising behind him as he disappeared into the heat shimmer from which he'd emerged. But his words hung in the air like poison, contaminating the safety and peace the boys had found. Thomas stood frozen on the porch, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just learned. His father hadn't just abandoned them. He'd betrayed them, sold them to pay for his own weakness and cowardice. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like a physical thing, threatening to crush the fragile hope he'd begun to nurture. Ezekiel holstered his gun and turned to face the boys, who had emerged from the kitchen despite Elena's attempts to keep them inside. His weathered face was gentle despite the violence that had just been avoided. "Boys," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The silence that followed Morrison's departure stretched across the Crawford ranch like a funeral shroud. 5 boys stood clustered on the porch, their faces reflecting every emotion from confusion to terror, while the adults who had promised to protect them struggled with the magnitude of what they now faced. Thomas Fletcher felt as though the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. Everything he'd believed about their situation, that their father was a dreamer and a drunk, but fundamentally decent, that they'd been abandoned through weakness rather than malice, had been stripped away in the space of a conversation. The man who should have protected them had instead offered them as payment for his own failures. "Inside," Ezekiel said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "All of us. We need to discuss what comes next." Elena ushered the boys through the front door, while Santiago remained outside, his weathered hands checking the loads in his rifle with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for siege. The message was clear. Whatever came next, the Crawford ranch was ready to defend itself. The main room felt different now, smaller somehow, as if Morrison's visit had contaminated the sense of safety that had filled it just hours before. William climbed immediately into Ezekiel's lap, his 4-year-old instincts telling him that proximity to the big man meant security. The other boys arranged themselves around the room with the careful spacing of people who weren't sure whether they should prepare to run or fight. "Before we talk about anything else," Ezekiel began, his grey eyes moving from face to face, "I want you boys to understand something. What that man said about your father, true or not, changes nothing about your place here. Nothing. You are not responsible for Marcus Fletcher's choices, and you will not be punished for them." Henry, always the most emotional of the brothers, began to cry with the quiet desperation of a child whose world had been shattered too many times. Why would Papa do that to us? Why would he promise us to bad men? Eleanor moved quickly to kneel beside the 8-year-old, gathering him into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her young. "Because some people, Mijo, they get so lost in their own pain that they forget what matters most. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Thomas wanted to accept that explanation, wanted to believe that his father's betrayal could be understood in terms of weakness rather than cruelty. But the cold logic that had kept his brothers alive for the past months wouldn't let him rest in such comfortable illusions. "He knew," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When he walked us to that station, he knew he wasn't coming. Back, he knew what he'd done to us. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. James, practical even at 10, nodded slowly as pieces of a puzzle fell into place in his mind. That's why he kept looking back as he walked away, not because he was sad, but because he was guilty. Michael, 6 years old and still young enough to hope for miracles, shook his head with violent denial. "No, Papa loves us. He said so. He said he'd always take care of us." "People say lots of things, Mijo," Santiago observed as he entered the house and carefully locked the door behind him. "What they do is what counts." Ezekiel shifted William to a more comfortable position and leaned forward, his massive frame somehow managing to convey both strength and gentleness. "Boys, I need to know everything about your father's habits, his associates, the places he took you over the past few months. If Morrison was telling the truth about gambling debts, then we need to understand what we're facing." Thomas closed his eyes and tried to organize the chaotic memories of their recent travels. "We were in San Francisco for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Papa said he had work on the docks, but most days he'd disappear after breakfast and come back late, smelling like whiskey and tobacco smoke." "Where did you stay?" Elena asked gently. "A boarding house near the waterfront, Mrs. Kelleher's place. She was kind to us, but Papa owed her money too. That's why we left so suddenly one morning. He said we had to go before she called the constables." James picked up the narrative with the precision that marked his methodical mind. "Before San Francisco, we were in Sacramento for a month. Papa worked in a saloon there, cleaning and serving drinks. But then he started playing cards with the customers instead of working, and the owner threw him out." "What was the name of this saloon?" Ezekiel asked, his detective instincts engaged despite the circumstances. "The Golden Nugget," Henry said, wiping his eyes. "I remember because there was a sign with a big yellow rock painted on it, and there were men there who scared me. They had mean eyes and loud voices." Santiago exchanged a meaningful look with Ezekiel. The Golden Nugget was known throughout Nevada and California as a place where serious gambling took place, where men lost ranches and fortunes over cards and dice. If Marcus Fletcher had been playing there, his debts could easily run into thousands of dollars. "Did your father ever mention specific names?" Ezekiel pressed. "Men he owed money to, people he was afraid of?" Thomas searched his memory, trying to recall conversations he'd only half understood at the time. There was a man named Carmichael who came to the boarding house once. Papa went white when he saw him, and they talked in whispers on the porch. After that, Papa started packing our things. Anything else? Any other names? Any other incidents? In Sacramento, Michael said unexpectedly, his young voice carrying more understanding than anyone had credited him with. Papa cried one night after he thought we were asleep. He kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over. When Thomas asked him what was wrong, he said he'd made a terrible mistake. The admission settled over the room like a physical weight. Even the youngest of them had sensed their father's growing desperation, his spiral into choices that would ultimately destroy them all. Elena stood and began pacing with the restless energy of a woman preparing for battle. So what do we do? These men, they will come. Morrison made that clear. And when they do, they won't be interested in conversation. We prepare, Ezekiel said simply. Santiago, how many men can we count on if it comes to fighting? Regular hands, maybe 6 who'd stand and fight for the ranch. Pablo's got 3 brothers, all good with rifles. Old Manuel served in the army before he came north. That's 10, counting us. Against how many? Santiago shrugged with the fatalism of a man who'd faced impossible odds before. Depends on how much money Marcus Fletcher owed, and how badly these men want to make an example. Could be 3, could be 30. William, who had been silent throughout the adult conversation, suddenly looked up at Ezekiel with eyes that held too much understanding. For his age, are the bad men going to take us away? Ezekiel's weathered face softened as he looked down at the little boy. They're going to try, son, but they'll have to get through me first, and I'm a hard man to get through. What if there are too many of them? William persisted with the terrible logic of childhood. Then we'll figure something else out. But William, I want you to remember something. Ezekiel's voice took on the cadence of a sacred vow. As long as I draw breath, no one takes you boys anywhere you don't want to go. That's a promise. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. At those words, a knot of fear and responsibility that had been growing tighter for months. For the first time since his mother's death, someone else was taking charge. Someone else was making the hard decisions and accepting the consequences. There's something else we need to consider, Elena said, her practical mind working through scenarios. The law. If these men have papers, if they can make their claims seem legitimate, the territorial authorities might not help us. Already thought of that, Ezekiel replied. Judge Harrison in Carson City owes me favors. I sent word this morning asking him to expedite adoption papers for all 5 boys. If I can become their legal guardian before these gamblers make their move, it changes everything. The word adoption hit the brothers like a thunderbolt. After months of abandonment and uncertainty, the idea that someone wanted to claim them permanently, legally, was almost too enormous to comprehend. You'd do, or that? Thomas asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Make us your sons, for real. Son, Ezekiel said quietly, I already have. The papers are just to make the government catch up with reality. Santiago cleared his throat with the embarrassment of a man unused to displays of emotion. Judge Harrison, he's a good man, but he's also cautious. Adoption papers take time, especially for 5 children at once. How long before these gambling men lose patience and come calling? Not long, Ezekiel admitted. Morrison will report back that I'm not going to cooperate, and his employers will decide whether to cut their losses or double down. Men who use children as collateral aren't known for their patience or restraint. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows at a lower angle now, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. Outside, the normal sounds of ranch life continued. Cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant voices of ranch hands going about their duties. But inside the main house, the conversation had turned to preparations for war. The boys can't stay. Here, Elena said suddenly, her maternal instincts overriding all other considerations. If fighting comes to the ranch, if bullets start flying, children should not be in the middle of it. "Where would we go?" Henry asked, fear creeping back into his voice. Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his strategic mind weighing options and risks. "There's a mission school in Carson City run by nuns. They take in children who need protection, no questions asked. It's not permanent, but it would be safe until this situation resolves itself." "No." Thomas's voice was firm, final. "We stay together. We stay with you. We're not running anymore." "Thomas," Ezekiel began. "No," Thomas repeated, standing up with the sudden authority of a boy, forced to become a man too young. "We've been running our whole lives, from debt collectors, from landlords, from our father's mistakes. It ends here. If these men want us, they can come and try to take us, but we don't hide anymore." His brothers looked at him with a mixture of admiration and terror, but James nodded slowly in agreement. "Thomas is right. We stick together. We help fight if we have to." "Boys, you don't understand what you're asking," Elena protested. "These are dangerous men who kill for money. This isn't a game. It wasn't a game when we were starving on that train platform either," Thomas replied. "We survived that, and we'll survive this. Together." Ezekiel studied the determined faces around him and felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. These children had been forged in hardship, tempered by abandonment, and they'd emerged with a strength that most adults never found. But strength alone wouldn't stop bullets or overcome impossible odds. "If you stay," he said finally, "you follow orders without question. If I tell you to hide, you hide. If I tell you to run, you run. This isn't negotiable." 5 heads nodded, in unison, and Ezekiel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. He'd taken in 5 hungry children and somehow acquired 5 sons and a war to fight. The mathematics of it should have been daunting, but instead he felt something he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death. Purpose that went beyond mere survival. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the western mountains, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, dangerous men were making plans that would determine whether the Crawford ranch remained a sanctuary or became a battlefield. But inside the house, a family was preparing to stand together against whatever came next. The Crawford ranch transformed overnight from peaceful homestead into fortress. As dawn broke over the Nevada landscape, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, armed men took positions around the property with the grim efficiency of soldiers preparing for siege. Santiago Martinez moved through the preparations, like a general organizing his troops, his weathered face set in lines of concentration. The years had not dimmed his tactical mind, and the ranch's layout provided numerous advantages for defenders willing to use them wisely. "Pablo, take your brothers to the ridge overlooking the north approach," he instructed in rapid Spanish before, switching to English for the benefit of the Fletcher boys, who watched the preparations with wide eyes. "Anyone comes from that direction, we see them 2 miles out." The young Mexican nodded and gathered his siblings, Carlos, 17, and already showing the steady hands of a natural marksman, Diego, 15, small but quick as a mountain cat, and Rico, barely 14, but with eyes that missed nothing. Each carried a rifle and enough ammunition for a prolonged fight. "Manuel," Santiago continued, addressing the grizzled ex-soldier who tended the vegetable garden with the same precision he'd once used to maintain army equipment. "You take the barn. Good sight lines to the main house, thick walls for cover. If shooting starts, keep their heads down while we move the boys to safety." Manuel spat tobacco juice into the dust and nodded grimly. "Como no, jefe? These pendejos want trouble. They find more than they bargained for." Ezekiel emerged from the house carrying a wooden crate that clinked metallically with each step. Inside, Thomas could see the dull gleam of rifle cartridges, carefully sorted by caliber and packed for easy distribution. The big rancher's face was calm, but his movements held the focused intensity of a man who'd fought for his life before and expected to do so again. "How many rifles do we have?" James asked, his 10-year-old practicality cutting through the romantic notions of warfare that might appeal to other children. "Enough," Ezekiel replied simply. "More important question is how many men we have who know how to use them properly. Santiago, counting everyone, maybe 12 who can shoot straight under pressure. The rest," Santiago shrugged eloquently, "they work cattle, not battlefields." Elena appeared in the doorway, her arms filled with medical supplies that she'd been gathering since before sunrise. Bandages, laudanum for pain, needles and thread for closing wounds, bottles of whiskey for sterilizing instruments. The sight of such preparations made the reality of what was coming unavoidably clear. "The root cellar," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd made her decision and would brook no argument. "I've stocked it with food, water, blankets. If fighting comes to the house, that's where the boys go. The walls are stone, 3 feet thick, safe as a bank vault." William, perched on Ezekiel's hip with the casual familiarity he'd developed overnight, looked around at the armed men and preparations with the wide-eyed fascination of childhood. "Are we going to win?" he asked, with the direct simplicity that only 4-year-olds possessed. Ezekiel's weathered face softened as he looked down at the boy. "Son, winning isn't always about who's left standing at the end. Sometimes it's about protecting what matters most, no matter the cost. What matters most? You, your brothers, this family we've built together. That's worth fighting for, worth dying for if it comes to that." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest at those words. In the span of 3 days, this massive, taciturn rancher had become more of a father than Marcus Fletcher had ever been. The idea that Ezekiel might die defending them was almost unbearable. "Maybe we should run," Thomas said quietly, the words painful to speak but impossible to ignore. "Maybe if we left, went far away, these men would forget about us." Santiago snorted with derision. "Men like Morrison's employers, they don't forget debts, especially not when their authority gets challenged. Running just makes the chase longer, not shorter." "Besides," Ezekiel added, his grey eyes holding depths of determination, "this is your home now, our home. A man doesn't run from his own land, not if he wants to look at himself in the mirror." Afterward, the morning progressed with the steady rhythm of military preparation. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, ammunition distributed, fields of fire established. The ranch hands who'd agreed to fight moved through their tasks with the quiet competence of men who understood that their lives might depend on attention to detail. Henry discovered a talent for running messages between the various defensive positions, his 8-year-old energy and artistic eye for detail making him an ideal scout. He reported back to Ezekiel with the precision of a military courier. "Manuel says he can see all the way to Devil's Creek from the barn loft. Pablo's brothers found tracks near the North Ridge, maybe 6 horses, moving east toward town yesterday afternoon." 6 horses, Santiago mused. Could be coincidence, could be Morrison gathering reinforcements. Michael appointed himself Elena's assistant in the medical preparations, his 6-year-old hands surprisingly gentle as he helped roll bandages and organize supplies. The work gave him something to focus on besides the fear that threatened to overwhelm them all. "Elena," he said, as they worked together in the kitchen, "what happens if someone gets hurt really bad, like worse than bandages can fix?" Elena's hands stilled on the supplies she was packing. "Then we pray, mijo. We pray and we do everything we can, and we hope it's enough. And if it's not enough," Elena pulled the boy close, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears, Then we remember that some things are worth any price, and love is the most important of them. As the sun climbed toward its midday peak, a rider appeared on the southern trail. Not the hard-riding messenger of war they'd been expecting, but Judge Harrison himself, accompanied by his clerk and 2 territorial marshals. The sight of official authority approaching sent a ripple of hope through the defensive preparations. Ezekiel met the judicial party at the main gate, his relief carefully controlled but visible to those who knew him well. Judge Harrison was a small, neat man with white whiskers and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to long rides, but his manner carried the authority of federal law. "Ezekiel," the judge said without preamble, "got your wire about adoption papers. Unusual request, 5 children at once, but I've brought the documents. Need to interview the boys individually, make sure they understand what's being proposed." "There's more to it than that, Your Honor," Ezekiel replied, gesturing toward the armed men visible around the ranch. "We may have visitors soon. Unwelcome ones." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose as he took in the preparations. "The wire mentioned some kind of threat. Care to elaborate?" Ezekiel quickly outlined Morrison's visit, the claims about gambling debts and false papers, the implicit threat of violence if the boys weren't surrendered. The judge listened with the careful attention of a man accustomed to separating truth from fiction, his expression growing increasingly grave. "These men, Morrison, represents," the judge asked when Ezekiel finished. "You have any idea who they might be specifically? Given the amounts of money we're talking about and the fact that they're using children as leverage, I'd guess the Carmichael organization out of San Francisco. They run high-stakes games, loan money at impossible rates, collect debts through intimidation and violence." Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "I know of them. Territorial authority has been trying to build a case for years, but they're careful, well-connected. If they've decided to collect on Marcus Fletcher's debt by taking his children," he trailed off, "the implications too dark to voice completely. Which is why I need those adoption papers signed and filed immediately," Ezekiel pressed. "Once those boys are legally my sons, Carmichael's people lose any claim to them, legitimate or otherwise. Assuming we have time to complete the process before they arrive in force." As if summoned by the judge's words, Pablo's voice rang out from his position on the North Ridge. "Riders coming. Many riders. Maybe 15, 20 men." The transformation was instantaneous. Armed ranch hands melted into previously prepared positions. Elena began herding the Fletcher brothers toward the house, her movements urgent but controlled. Judge Harrison and his party took shelter behind the main gate's stone pillars, their faces pale but resolute. Ezekiel climbed onto the porch roof for a better view, his spyglass extended toward the approaching dust cloud. What he saw there made his jaw tighten with grim determination. 23 riders, he called down to Santiago. Well armed, moving in military formation. This isn't a negotiation, it's a raid. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Despite all the preparations, despite the brave words and careful planning, the reality of facing 23 armed men with their small force seemed impossibly daunting. Can we hold them off? He asked Ezekiel as the big man climbed down from the roof. Ezekiel's gray eyes met his with unflinching honesty. Son, we're going to try, but if this goes badly, if they get past our defenses, you boys get to that route. Sella, and you stay there no matter what you hear outside. Promise me. What about you? What about Elena and Santiago? We'll do what we have to do. But those men out there, they want you boys alive for leverage. They won't be so careful with the rest of us. The dust cloud grew larger, more defined, as the approaching riders crested the final ridge before the ranch. Through the spyglass, individual figures began to emerge, hard-faced men with the look of professional killers, their weapons prominent and ready for use. Judge, Ezekiel called, how long to complete those adoption papers? 10 minutes if we skip the formalities. Then we'd better get started. Santiago, hold them off as long as you can. Give the judge time to work. The riders were close enough. Now that individual voices could be heard, harsh laughter and crude jests that spoke of men confident in their superior numbers. At their head rode Morrison, no longer playing the role of legitimate detective, but showing his true colors as an enforcer for criminal interests. Ezekiel gathered the 5 Fletcher brothers around him, kneeling so he could look each one in the eye. Boys, in about 2 minutes, those men are going to demand that you come with them. When they do, Judge Harrison is going to tell them that you're legally my adopted sons, under the protection of territorial law. Will that stop them? William asked, his 4-year-old voice very small. Maybe, maybe not, but it gives us the legal high ground, and sometimes that's enough to make bad men think twice. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the metallic click of weapons being readied. Through the windows, the boys could see armed figures spreading out around the ranch house, cutting off escape routes with the precision of experienced raiders. Judge Harrison's pen scratched rapidly across official documents, his clerk applying seals and stamps with desperate efficiency. Elena stood behind the boys, her hands resting protectively on their shoulders, while Santiago positioned himself at the front window with his rifle ready. Remember, Ezekiel said quietly, no matter what happens, you boys are Crawfords now. My sons. That means something, legally and morally, and Crawfords don't surrender to criminals. Outside, Morrison's voice rang across the yard, carrying the false authority of a man backed by superior firepower. Crawford, send out those boys and nobody gets hurt. You've got 1 minute to decide. Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his pen still moving. 30 seconds more. Ezekiel checked his revolver one final time, the cylinder spinning smoothly in his massive hand. Around the house, his men waited with the patience of professionals, their weapons trained on targets, their hearts steeled for what was coming. Fletcher brothers, soon to be Crawford brothers, stood together in the center of the room, their faces reflecting every emotion from terror to determination. They'd been abandoned once, betrayed by the man who should have protected them. But they'd found something here worth fighting for, something worth the terrible price that might be demanded. "Time's up, Crawford," Morrison shouted. "Send them out or we come in shooting." Judge Harrison's pen completed the final signature with a flourish. "It's done. They're legally yours, Ezekiel, all 5 of them." Ezekiel Crawford stood to his full, impressive height, his weathered face set in lines of absolute resolve. Outside, 23 armed men waited for his answer. Inside, his newly adopted sons looked to him for protection and guidance. He walked to the front door, threw it open, and stepped onto the porch with the fearless dignity of a man defending his own blood. "Then you'd better come shooting," he called back, "because these boys aren't going anywhere." The first shot shattered the Nevada stillness like breaking glass, Morrison's rifle speaking before Ezekiel's words had fully faded into the desert air. The bullet splintered the porch rail inches from where the big rancher stood, sending wood fragments flying like angry wasps. But Ezekiel Crawford didn't flinch. He remained planted on his porch like an ancient oak, his massive frame silhouetted against the ranch house door, his own weapon rising with deliberate calm to answer Morrison's challenge. The Colt .45 bucked in his hand with a sound like thunder, and Morrison's hat flew from his head, the bullet passing close enough to part his hair. The message was unmistakable. If you want a war, you'll get one, but it won't be the easy victory you expected. Take cover. Santiago's voice rang out from his position near the barn, and the battle erupted in earnest. 23 rifles opened. Fire simultaneously, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the afternoon sun. The ranch house shuddered under the impact of dozens of bullets, windows exploding inward, wooden siding splintering and cracking. But the Crawford defenders were ready. Pablo's brothers on the North Ridge opened fire with the precision of hunters, who'd been feeding their families with single shots since childhood. Carlos's rifle found its mark immediately, dropping one of Morrison's men from his saddle with a cry that cut through the chaos. Diego and Rico worked in tandem, their shots creating a deadly crossfire that forced the attackers to take cover, behind whatever shelter they could find. From the barn loft, Manuel's weathered hands worked his Spencer repeating rifle with the mechanical precision of a man who'd fought Apaches and lived to tell about it. Each shot was carefully aimed, methodically delivered, designed not just to kill, but to demonstrate that the ranch's defenders wouldn't break under pressure. Inside the house, Judge Harrison crouched behind the overturned dining table with his clerk, both men pale but determined. The territorial marshals, who'd accompanied him, took positions at the shattered windows, their badges meaning nothing in this moment but their rifles speaking with federal authority. Elena hustled the 5 Fletcher, now Crawford brothers, toward the kitchen and the entrance to the root cellar, her maternal instincts overriding the terror that threatened to paralyze her. "Quickly, mijos! Down the stairs! Stay low!" But Thomas hesitated at the cellar entrance, his 12-year-old sense of responsibility warring with the need for safety. Through the kitchen window, he could see Ezekiel on the porch, the man who'd claimed them as sons, standing alone against impossible odds. "I can't," Thomas said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I can't hide while he fights for us." "Thomas, no!" Elena reached for him, but the boy was already moving, darting toward the front of the house where Ezekiel had taken shelter behind the porch pillars. A bullet whined past Thomas's ear as he dove for cover beside his adopted father. The sound, close enough to feel the heat of its passage. Ezekiel's eyes flashed with anger and fear as he saw the boy beside him. "What the hell are you doing? I told you to get to the cellar." "I'm a Crawford now," Thomas replied, with the fierce determination of youth. Crawfords stand together. Before Ezekiel could respond, James appeared at his other side, having followed his older brother with the loyalty that had kept them alive through months of hardship. Then Henry, his 8-year-old face set in lines of stubborn courage. Even Michael, barely 6, crawled across the bullet-swept porch to join them. Only William remained with Elena in the relative safety of the kitchen, his 4-year-old legs too short, and his understanding too limited to make the desperate dash his. Their brothers had attempted. "Damn foolish children," Ezekiel muttered, but there was pride mixed with the exasperation in his voice. He'd wanted sons who would stand with him, and apparently he'd gotten exactly that. The siege continued with deadly intensity. Morrison's men had spread out in a rough circle around the ranch house, using outbuildings and cattle troughs for cover as they poured rifle fire into the defenders' positions. But their superior numbers were being negated by the careful preparation and tactical advantage the ranch provided. Santiago had positioned his men perfectly. Every approach to the house was covered by at least 2 rifles. Every piece of cover the attackers might use was within range of defensive fire. The battle had devolved into a deadly game of patience. Who would run out of ammunition first? Who would make the fatal mistake that would tip the balance? "Crawford!" Morrison's voice carried across the gunfire, hoarse with rage and desperation. "This is your last chance. Send out those boys and we'll let the rest of you live." Ezekiel's answer came in the form of another carefully aimed shot that sent Morrison diving for better cover. The big rancher's marksmanship was legendary throughout Nevada, and every bullet he fired found its intended target or came close enough to remind his enemies that distance was no protection. But ammunition was finite, and Morrison's men had come, prepared for a prolonged fight. They'd established supply lines, positioned themselves for mutual support, and showed the kind of professional competence that came from years of violent business. "How long can we hold them?" Thomas asked during a brief lull in the firing. "Long as we have bullets and the will to use them," Ezekiel replied grimly, "but they know that too. Question is whether they're willing to take the casualties it'll cost to overrun us." The answer came sooner than expected. Morrison, driven by Desperation and the knowledge that failure meant answering to men who didn't accept excuses ordered a coordinated assault on the ranch house. "All positions now!" His voice carried clearly across the yard. "Overwhelm them!" 20 men rose from their positions simultaneously, charging toward the house with rifles blazing and death in their eyes. The coordinated attack was designed to succeed through sheer volume of fire, to break the defenders' resistance through overwhelming force. But Santiago Martinez had fought in the Mexican War, and he'd learned lessons about defensive tactics that served him well now. "Wait for it," he called to his men. "Let them get close, make every shot count." The attackers covered half the distance to the house before the defenders opened fire. When they did, it was with devastating effect. Pablo's brothers on the ridge had clear shots at the charging men's backs. Manuel in the barn loft caught them in a deadly crossfire. The territorial marshals at the windows picked their targets. With federal precision, the charge broke against the ranch's defenses like a wave against a cliff. Men fell screaming, others dove for whatever cover they could find, and the coordinated assault dissolved into chaos and retreat, but not without cost. A bullet shattered the window frame inches from James's head, showering him with glass that drew blood from a dozen small cuts. Another shot punched through the porch pillar that sheltered Henry, the 10-year-old boy, feeling the shock of the bullet's passage through the wood. "Santiago's hit," Eleanor's voice carried from the kitchen where she tended the wounded foreman. The old soldier had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but his weathered face showed more anger than pain as Elena worked to stop the bleeding. "How bad?" Ezekiel called back without taking his eyes off his rifle sights. "Bad enough. He won't be doing any more shooting today." The loss of Santiago's rifle was felt immediately. The defensive perimeter had gaps now, places where Morrison's men could advance without fear of precise return fire. The attackers were learning, adapting, finding ways to exploit the ranch's weaknesses. Morrison himself had worked his way closer to the house, using a water trough for cover as he directed his men's movements. His false detective's demeanor had been completely abandoned, replaced by the cold professionalism of a man who killed for money. "You're fighting for nothing, Crawford," he called during another lull. "Those boys' father signed legal papers. They belong to my employers, and will have them." Judge Harrison's voice answered from inside the house, carrying the authority of territorial law. "Those papers are worthless. I've seen them, and they're fraudulent. These children are now legally adopted by Ezekiel Crawford under territorial statute." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Law doesn't mean much out here, Judge, not when it's 23 guns against 12. But even as he spoke, the sound of distant hoofbeats began to echo from the eastern trail. At first, it was barely audible above the sporadic gunfire, just a rhythmic drumming that might have been mistaken for the pounding of frightened hearts. Then it grew louder, more distinct, accompanied by voices raised in something that sounded suspiciously like a war cry. Pablo's voice rang out from the North Ridge, filled with excitement and relief. "Riders coming, many riders, from the east." Through his spyglass, Ezekiel could see them now, at least 30 horsemen approaching at full gallop, their movements coordinated and purposeful. For a moment, his heart sank with the thought that Morrison's employers had sent reinforcements, that the impossible odds were about to become truly insurmountable. But as the riders drew closer, details became clear that changed everything. These weren't professional killers or hired guns. These were ranchers, townspeople, ordinary citizens of the Nevada territory who'd heard about the siege and decided to act. Leading them was Sheriff Tom Bradley from Carson City, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun and his face set in lines of official determination. Behind him rode ranchers from neighboring spreads, shopkeepers from town, even the local preacher with a rifle across his saddle and fire in his eyes. "Sheriff's Department!" Bradley's voice carried clearly across the battlefield as his posse spread out to surround Morrison's position. Lay down your weapons. You're under arrest for assault, attempted kidnapping, and violation of territorial law." The tide of battle shifted in an instant. Morrison's men, caught between the ranch's defenders and 30 fresh rifles, found themselves surrounded and outgunned. Several immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Others looked to Morrison for leadership, but their employer was calculating odds that had suddenly turned impossible. "This isn't over, Crawford," Morrison snarled, but his voice held more desperation than conviction. "My employers don't forget, and they don't forgive." "Then they can take it up with territorial law," Sheriff Bradley replied, his rifle trained on Morrison's chest. "You and your men are going to stand trial for what you've done here today." The siege of the Crawford ranch was over, but the cost had been high. 3 of Morrison's men lay dead in the yard, their blood seeping into the Nevada soil. Several others bore wounds that would heal slowly, if at all. On the defenders' side, Santiago's shoulder wound was the most serious, but cuts from flying. Glass and splinters had marked nearly everyone who'd taken part in the fight. As the captured gunmen were loaded onto wagons for transport to the territorial jail, Thomas Crawford, the name felt strange but right in his mind, stood on the bullet-scarred porch beside the man who'd chosen to fight 23 armed criminals rather than surrender 5 hungry children. "Is it really over?" he asked, his 12-year-old voice carrying the weight of experiences no child should have to bear. Ezekiel's weathered hand rested on the boy's shoulder, heavy with protection and promise. "This part is, son. Morrison and his men won't be bothering anyone for a long time, but there might be others someday. Men like the ones he worked for don't give up easy. Then we'll face them too," Thomas replied, with the fierce determination that had kept his brothers alive through months of hardship. "Together, as a family." Through the shattered windows of the ranch house, the sound of William's laughter drifted out into the afternoon air. Elena was telling the 4-year-old stories to distract him from the violence he'd witnessed, her gentle voice weaving tales of horses and heroes and happily ever afters. James and Henry were helping Judge Harrison organize the legal documents that had transformed them from abandoned orphans into the Crawford sons, their young hands careful with papers that represented security and belonging. Michael was following the sheriff around the yard, asking endless questions about law enforcement with the fascination of a 6-year-old who'd just witnessed good triumph over evil. The ranch house would need repairs, new windows, fresh siding, patches for bullet holes that told the story of the day 5 hungry children found a man willing to die for them. But it was still standing, still home, still the place where the impossible had happened. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezekiel Crawford stood surrounded by his adopted sons and knew that every bullet fired, every risk taken, every moment of terror endured had been worth this single perfect moment of victory. The Fletcher brothers had ceased to exist. In their place stood the Crawford boys, claimed and protected by a giant of a man whose heart had been large enough to adopt 5 strangers and transform them into family. But even in victory, shadows lingered on the horizon, and the mention of Morrison's mysterious employers suggested that this battle, however decisive, might only be the first in a longer war for the right to live free from the sins of Marcus Fletcher's past. 3 months later, the Crawford ranch bore little resemblance to the battle-scarred homestead that had weathered Morrison's siege. New glass sparkled in repaired windows, fresh paint covered the bullet holes in the siding, and the sound of children's laughter had replaced the echo of gunfire that had once filled the Nevada air. Thomas Crawford, the name now felt as natural as breathing, stood in the doorway of the barn, watching his youngest brother William attempt to bridle a patient mare under Santiago's careful supervision. The old foreman's left arm still hung slightly crooked from his shoulder wound, but his weathered face carried the satisfaction of a teacher watching his student master a difficult lesson. "Gently, mijo," Santiago instructed in his accented English, his hands guiding William's small fingers as they worked the leather straps. "The horse, she knows if you are afraid or angry. Be calm, be sure, and she will trust you." At 4 years old, William had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds since arriving at the ranch. His cheeks carried the healthy flush of a child who never wondered where his next meal would come from, and his eyes held the bright curiosity of someone discovering that the world could be safe and wonderful. "Look, Thomas," William called out with pride as he successfully slipped the bridle over the mare's head. "I did it all by myself." "I see that, little brother," Thomas replied, the words "little brother" carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. "Pretty soon you'll be riding better than all of us." Across the yard, Henry had set up an easel near the corral fence, his artist's eye capturing the play of morning light on the horses' coats with watercolors Elena had ordered from San Francisco. At 9 years old, he'd discovered a talent that bloomed under the encouragement of adults who believed children should pursue their gifts rather than simply survive. James was in the vegetable garden with Manuel, learning the art of coaxing life from Nevada soil through patience and knowledge, passed down through generations. His practical mind had found satisfaction in the science of agriculture, the precise calculations of seed spacing and irrigation that turned barren ground into abundance. Michael had appointed himself chief assistant to Elena in the kitchen, his 7-year-old enthusiasm making up for his occasional lack of coordination, as he helped prepare meals that fed not just the Crawford family, but often the entire crew of ranch hands who'd become extended family. The transformation in all 5 boys was remarkable, but nowhere more evident than in their relationship with Ezekiel Crawford himself. The giant rancher who'd lived in solitude for 7 years had discovered that his heart was large enough to hold 5 sons, each different but equally precious. This particular morning brought visitors to the ranch, not the threatening kind that had once sought to tear their family apart, but the welcome sort that came with news and friendship. Judge Harrison's carriage appeared on the Eastern Trail, accompanied by a rider Thomas recognized as Sheriff Bradley from Carson City. Ezekiel emerged from the house to greet their guests, his massive frame moving with the easy confidence of a man at peace with his choices. The legal battles that had followed Morrison's capture were finally concluded, and Judge Harrison's visit carried the promise of permanent resolution. "Judge, Sheriff," Ezekiel said, shaking hands with both men as they dismounted. "Good to see you both. Elena's got coffee brewing and fresh biscuits in the oven." "Sounds perfect," Judge Harrison replied, his white whiskers unable to hide his pleased smile. "I bring good news, Ezekiel, the kind that calls for celebration." They gathered in the main room where Catherine's piano still held its place of honor, the sheet music now supplemented by Henry's drawings and Michael's school papers, evidence of a house that had learned to be alive again. Elena served coffee and biscuits while the boys arranged themselves around the room with the casual familiarity of children who knew they belonged. "Morrison's trial concluded yesterday," Sheriff Bradley began without preamble. He and his men were convicted on all charges: assault with deadly weapons, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy, and several federal violations. They'll be in territorial prison for the next 15 years, minimum. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The immediate threat was over, permanently ended by territorial justice. More importantly, Judge Harrison added, pulling official documents from his leather case, the investigation into Morrison's employers has yielded remarkable results. It seems the Carmichael organization had been operating under false federal protection, bribes to corrupt officials, forged documents, intimidation of witnesses. When the truth came out, the entire network collapsed. Ezekiel leaned forward in his chair, William perched comfortably on his knee. Meaning what exactly? Meaning Marcus Fletcher's debts died with the criminal organization that held them. The boys are free, legally and practically, from any claims related to their father's gambling. Eleanor crossed herself with quiet gratitude. Gracias a Dios. Finally, it is truly finished. But Judge Harrison held up a hand, his expression growing more serious. There's something else, something about Marcus Fletcher himself. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of horses in the corral. Thomas felt his stomach clench with familiar dread, the instinctive fear that his father's shadow might still reach across the miles to destroy the happiness they'd found. "He's dead," the judge said quietly, his voice gentle with understanding of what those words would mean to 5 boys who'd been abandoned by their father. "Died in a mining accident outside Denver 2 months ago. His body was identified by personal effects confirmed by several witnesses. The silence that followed was complex, layered with emotions too tangled to easily separate. Relief that Marcus Fletcher could never again disrupt their lives. Grief for the father who might have been if he'd made different choices. And something that might have been freedom from the last chains of their past." Thomas surprised himself by feeling tears on his cheeks, not for the man who'd betrayed them, but for the father they'd deserved and never had. Around him, his brothers processed the news in their own ways. James, with his typical quiet acceptance, Henry with the emotional openness that marked his artistic soul, Michael with the confusion of someone too young to fully understand death, William with the trusting certainty that the important people in his life were still there. "Does this change anything?" Thomas asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "About our adoption, about us being Crawfords?" "Not a thing," Judge Harrison replied firmly. "You boys are legally and permanently Ezekiel Crawford's sons. Marcus Fletcher's death actually simplifies matters, removes any possibility of future challenges to your family status." Ezekiel's arms tightened protectively around William, while his eyes moved over each of his adopted sons with an expression of fierce love. "You boys understand what this means? You're Crawfords now. Not just in name, but in truth. Forever. Forever," William repeated with the simple certainty of childhood, snuggling closer to the man who'd become his father in every way that mattered. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat, producing a small cloth bag from his vest pocket. "There's one more thing. Fletcher's personal effects. Thought you boys might want to see them, decide what to keep or discard." The bag contained pathetically few items. A tarnished pocket watch that had belonged to their grandfather, a faded photograph of their mother holding baby William, a small leather journal filled with Marcus Fletcher's increasingly desperate thoughts and failed schemes. Thomas accepted the items with careful hands, studying the photograph of Elizabeth Fletcher, with eyes that barely remembered her face. She'd been beautiful in the way that mattered most, the kind of beauty that came from loving her children more than her own comfort. "She would have been proud of you boys," Eleanor said softly, her maternal instincts reading the moment perfectly. "Proud of how you survived, how you protected each other, how you've grown into fine young men." Henry looked up from the watercolor he'd been working on, his artist's eye bright with sudden inspiration. "Could we put Mama's picture on the piano, next to Catherine's, so they could be together?" Ezekiel's weathered face softened with understanding. "I think Catherine would like that very much, and your mama, too." As the afternoon progressed, the conversation turned to happier topics. Judge Harrison spoke of the new school being built in Carson City, where the boys would receive proper education, alongside their ranch training. Sheriff Bradley shared news from around the territory, tales of honest progress and growing communities that promised a future built on law rather than violence. Santiago joined them for the evening meal, his presence adding the warmth of extended family to their gathering. Pablo and his brothers were there too, along with Manuel and several other ranch hands who'd proven their loyalty during the siege. The dining room that had once echoed with emptiness now buzzed with the conversation of people who'd chosen to be family. After their guests departed and the boys settled into their evening routines, Thomas found himself on the front porch with Ezekiel, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. The conversation was comfortable, filled with the easy silence of people who no longer needed words to understand each other. "Any regrets?" Ezekiel asked finally, his deep voice carrying genuine curiosity. "About leaving your old life behind, taking on the Crawford name?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought of the months of hunger and uncertainty, the fear that had been their constant companion, the weight of responsibility he'd carried for brothers who deserved better than survival. "No regrets," he said finally. "We were never really Fletchers anyway. We were just 5 boys trying to stay alive. But we're Crawfords for real, chosen and claimed and fought for." Ezekiel's hand rested on the boy's shoulder with familiar weight. "You know this ranch will be yours someday, all of you together. It's going to take all 5 Crawford sons to keep it running properly." The future stretched before them like the Nevada landscape itself, vast, challenging, full of possibilities, limited only by their courage and determination. There would be good years and hard years, times of plenty and times of struggle, but they would face them together, as family, with the strength that came from being wanted and loved. Inside the house, William's sleepy voice could be heard asking Elena for one more story, while James and Henry debated the merits of different horse breeds with the intensity of young experts. Michael was probably reorganizing his collection of interesting rocks for the 100th time, finding new beauty in familiar treasures. "Think they'll remember this?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the warm lights of home. "Years from now, when they're grown men with families of their own, will they remember what it felt like to be wanted?" Ezekiel's smile was barely visible in the starlight, but Thomas could hear it in his voice. "Son, some things get burned so deep into a person's soul that time can't touch them. Love like this, security like this, the feeling of belonging somewhere, that becomes part of who they are. They'll remember, and someday they'll pass it on to children of their own." As if summoned by their conversation, the other boys drifted out onto the porch one by one. First William, then Michael, Henry, and finally James. They arranged themselves around Ezekiel's chair with the unconscious choreography of children seeking comfort and closeness. "Tell us about the wild horses again," William requested sleepily, his 4-year-old faith absolute that his adopted father would have both time and patience for stories. And so Ezekiel Crawford, who'd been alone for 7 years, found himself surrounded by 5 sons as he spoke of mustangs running free across the Nevada ranges, of horses that chose their families rather than being caught, of the difference between being broken and being gentled. The desert wind carried his voice across the ranch lands where cattle grazed peacefully and horses moved like shadows in the moonlight. It was the sound of home, of family, of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the wild sound echoing off canyon walls before fading into the vast silence of the American West. But on the Crawford Ranch, there was no longer any emptiness to fill that silence. There was only the sound of belonging, as natural and enduring as the stars themselves. The story that had begun with 5 hungry boys abandoned at a train station had become the story of the Crawford family, built not on blood, but on choice, not on obligation, but on love, not on what they'd lost, but on what they'd found in each other. And in the morning, when the sun rose over their Nevada home, it would illuminate not the end of their story, but the beginning of all the stories yet to be told. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.